Hello, I'm Stefan Hertog, Associate Professor in the Government Department at the LSE. I'm here with Gregory Gause, Professor of Political Science at the University of Vermont. Today, Gregory is giving a public lecture at the LSE titled The New Middle East Cold War, which has been organized by the LSE Ideas Kuwait program and the LSE Middle East Center. Welcome to the LSE, Gregory.
It's a pleasure to be here.
First question, what do you mean by a new Middle East Cold War?
Well, it's new because it's very similar to what the classic Arab Cold War in the 50s and 60s was, when Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Arab nationalists challenged what they called the reactionaries in Saudi Arabia and Jordan, the monarchies, the pro-Western countries, but also where the quote-unquote progressives, Arab nationalists themselves, had falling outs. Nasser in Egypt and Abdul Karim Qasim in Iraq. It's very similar to the situation now, in that the contest for influence is being played out not on the battlefield, right, but through proxy wars, which are themselves very violent, but in domestic contexts like Syria, like Lebanon, like Iraq.
And why is it that Syria has become the central locale of struggle in that new Cold War?
Well, the two main protagonists in this new Middle East Cold War, not the only ones, but the two main ones are Iran and Saudi Arabia. And the Iranians really have had the run of things in recent years. They're the dominant player in Iraqi politics. Their ally Hezbollah is the most important player in Lebanese politics. They have influence in the Palestinian community through their relationship with Hamas. And the Saudis are trying to roll back Iranian influence in the Arab world. Syria seems to be their best opportunity to do that. The Assad regime has a long-standing relationship with the Iranians, and if the Saudis and other Arab states like Qatar, who are supporting the rebels, can help the rebels overthrow the Assad regime, it means a real blow to Iranian influence in the Eastern Arab world.
But are you suggesting that currently Iran has the upper hand in that struggle?
I do think that in the new Middle East Cold War, Iran does have the upper hand. When the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, it opened up Iraq as a geopolitical playing field. And Iran has been able to take advantage of its ties to the Shia community in Iraq, as well as its ties to some of the Kurdish factions, to become really the dominant outside player in Iraqi politics. They have this strong relationship with the Assad regime that dates back for decades, and their protege, Hezbollah, is the most important player in Lebanese politics. Given that, the Iranians have quite a bit of influence in that arc between the Mediterranean and the Gulf.
Now, how does the new emerging anti-Muslim Brotherhood front play into that whole game? That there's a new alliance between Egypt, Saudi Arabia and the UAE trying to suppress the Ikhwan as a political force in the region. How does Iran relate to that?
Well, I think it's very interesting in that lots of people tend to think of this conflict as a Sunni-Shia conflict. But if it were purely sectarian, the Saudis should be welcoming the Muslim Brotherhood as a fellow Sunni ally in a sectarian fight. But instead, the Saudis, the new Egyptian regime, the regime in the United Arab Emirates see the Muslim Brotherhood as a threat to their geopolitical position and perhaps even to their domestic regime security. So if this is a sectarian fight, the Sunnis do not have their act together. I see this as very, very similar to the kinds of divisions we saw back in the 1950s and 60s during the Nasserist period, when progressive groups, Arab nationalist groups like the Ba'ath Party or Abdul Karim Qasim, the president of Iraq, although they avowed the same ideology as Nasser, competed with Nasser for influence. And I think within the Sunni community, you see this very, very strong competition for, if you will, being able to define what Sunni Islam means for politics between the Muslim Brotherhood and the more electoral tendency there to come to power through democratic elections, and the Saudi Emirati view of what a good Sunni Islamic political order would look like.
What is the role of outside players like the EU or the United States in that new setup?
Because so much of this new Middle East Cold War is taking place within the domestic politics of countries. It really is a fight about the direction of domestic politics in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Palestine, in Yemen, perhaps even if we can extend it out to Libya, right, which is not really involved with the Iranians, but I think it will become a playing field in this Muslim Brotherhood versus Saudi Emirati element of the new Middle East Cold War. Because so much of this revolves around the direction of domestic politics, I think it's really hard for outsiders, I mean, people completely outside the region, like the US or the EU, to have a decisive influence. I mean, short of the kind of military intervention we saw in Libya in 2011, it seems to me that the kinds of tools that the Americans and the Europeans have, aid, training, diplomatic pressure, aren't going to be adequate to direct the domestic politics of these countries. And of course, the more extreme case, when the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, even with over 100,000 American troops in Iraq, Washington couldn't determine the direction of Iraqi politics.
Well, thank you very much, Greg. That was
My
very
pleasure.
informative.